All.
Morning.
Good morning and welcome to the Cathedral of St. Philip on the last day of May, which this year is the day of Pentecost. My name is George Maxwell. I'm the vicar of the cathedral, and it's a privilege to be with you this morning. It's been a difficult several days in Atlanta. We all knew about the events in Minneapolis and the reaction of people there, but that reaction quickly spread across the country and really hit Atlanta hard over the last several days. We talked a bit about what Pentecost might mean in my sermon this morning. I view the flame of Pentecost as the story of Christ that bridges the differences between bonded groups. And I talked about the importance as believers, as followers of Christ, to tell who we are. And I want to go into those concepts a little more deeply here. I have drawn some of what I have to say, particularly the very end of this presentation, from a book by Arthur Brooks called Love Your Enemies. Brooks is a conservative, but I think makes a lot of sense here for liberals and conservatives in the way he approaches what he calls a culture of contempt. Yes, I know you were wondering, the book is available at the Cathedral Bookstore, which hopefully will be open next week. But even now, you can order it online and we will drop ship it to you. Let's start with this verse from the Beatitudes in Matthew. You have heard that it was said, you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Everything I have to say today is really grounded in this concept of love, a concept that I believe is at the heart of faith, to align ourselves with love, to find love within us, and to show love to others. But I'm going to maintain today that love is not a squishy concept, that love is not about just being nice, and that love is not about just being passive. Love is an active engagement. Yes, we want the good of the other, but the good of the other is about health, and health is about truth and dignity and spine sometimes. I want to show you two people who I think have emerged in the last several days as leaders, and to me, heroes. But I also want to focus on how they are loving, because I think they have been loving. The first person is the chief of police in Atlanta, Georgia. And I want to show you this clip, which came from Friday night, as she literally waded into the crowd in front of the CNN Center and had this to say. Dan?
Back live now to Hope Ford on the ground with Chief Shields.
In Minneapolis, we're appalling. The district attorney's response was worse. People are upset, they're angry, they're scared, and I get it. They want to be heard.
How is your department reacting to this? We've seen pretty passive right now, but we've also heard on the loudspeaker that they do want to open up the road for traffic.
You know what? My takeaway is there really isn't traffic. The city's largely closed, so people want to stay in the street. All right. Hey.
Chief, is there any sort of curfew in place tonight?
Is there any what?
Is there any sort of curfew in place tonight?
No.
How do you feel about what's happening here between the officers and the protesters?
You know what? Folks are upset. They want to be heard, and I think they have a right to be heard. And, you know, my thing is I don't want anyone to get hurt. I don't want to see property damage, but to be heard, I get it.
So reflecting on that clip just briefly, I want to think about what we learned about love from the chief of police. When she wanders into that crowd, she is engaging the very people that are going to cause trouble for her. And in doing so, she is personal and available. And I think that speaks volumes. But when she says they want to be heard, I think she means more than they have a First Amendment right to free speech. I think she means that they are people and that they matter, and that she is according them dignity by her presence and the way that she is trying to balance safety and that First Amendment freedom. So when we talk about people not being heard, at least to me, that's not just about free speech. That is about recognizing that we respect as Christians the dignity of every human being. And we do that by treating them with respect, by being nice to them, but also by being firm with them. So this is the very same woman who the next night after things got out of hand did not hesitate to use force, right? This is not all about being passive or having a certain feeling. It's about respecting people and then reacting or responding without reacting when you need to, because she's got to balance the rights, not just of the protesters, but of the entire city. And I also want to point out how clear she was about what happened in Minneapolis and how willing she was to judge the truth of that situation. She didn't dodge the question, and she didn't obfuscate in her answer. She was very clear, which is what we are when we respect somebody. We are clear in ways that can be heard. There's another leader, though, that emerged, another, I think, picture of what love looks like, and that came from our mayor. In particular, on Friday night, I was, as many others across the country, so taken with the way she approached her press conference, the leaders that she gathered to speak, but in particular what she had to say and how she was so real, how she was there as a woman, how she was there as a mother, how she was there as a mayor. And while there was plenty of compassion there and passion, there was no shortage of strength. And so she gives us this picture of love that, in my view, encompasses all of those very important characteristics. Dan.
When I saw the murder of George Floyd, I hurt like a mother would hurt. And on yesterday, when I heard there were rumors about violent protests in Atlanta, I did what a mother would do. I called my son and I said, "Where are you?" I said, "I cannot protect you, and black boys shouldn't be out today." So what I see happening on the streets of Atlanta is not Atlanta. This is not a protest. This is not in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. This is chaos. A protest has purpose. When Dr. King was assassinated, we didn't do this to our city. So if you love this city that has had a legacy of black mayors and black police chiefs and people who care about this city, where more than 50% of the business owners in Metro Atlanta are minority business owners. If you care about this city, then go home.
I'm duty bound to be here to simply say that it is your duty not to burn your own house down for anger with an enemy. It is your duty to fortify your own house so that you may be a house of refuge in times of organization. And now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. It is time to beat up prosecutors you don't like at the voting booth. It is time to hold mayoral offices accountable, chiefs and deputy chiefs. Atlanta is not perfect, but we're a lot better than we ever were, and we're a lot better than cities are.
In each of those clips, I'm struck by a commitment to the common good and by an awareness that what's going on is not easy to describe. It's hard to come to a right or a wrong that encompasses everything that's going on. It's complicated. There are good actors and there are bad actors. If you watch the interviews with people in the streets, it's hard to imagine that some of the very articulate voices interviewed were the same people running through Phipps Mall, just to be blunt about it. And yet, this is Atlanta, and it's heartbreaking to me, and I suspect to many of you, to see this happening in our city when we thought we had moved past some of this. I happen to believe that we did a good job of dealing with this as well as we could, because it's happening all over the country, and that Shields and Bottoms had a lot to do with that, and that there's a good example of love there that is recognizable as Christian love, but which isn't passive and isn't weak. It tells the truth, it is honest, and it respects the dignity of every person while not putting up with things that ought not to be put up with, if you will. I want to stop here and see if you have any questions, because I'm going to pivot to a slightly larger theme that I think this plays into. So Dan, would you remind us how to ask questions?
Sure thing. I think we can simply unmute ourselves and jump right in.
Go ahead. It absolutely, this is Jenny, and I say to you that it absolutely breaks my heart what happened in our city. And I think it's probably long overdue. I think that we, as basically mostly white people, are not paying attention the way we should to better education, police abuse, et cetera, et cetera. And somehow we have got to get where we can look on the kind side, and I mean kind to all people, to get on the kind side to try to help people and get rid of seeing color.
Thank you.
If I could build on that and offer just a slight adjustment. I think I would agree with you, but I would add that it has to be more than white people's problem, because I read a very powerful article this weekend in the New York Times by David Brooks, and if folks get a chance to read it, I urge you to read it. I think there's something else though. I think we have to also get back to an idea around how we teach character and leadership from a civic standpoint amongst our young people and amongst ourselves, so that we stop becoming so soundbite and moment focused. And the example I'll use, George, is I remember the reaction that everybody had around Colin Kaepernick's protest. And that was a nonviolent attempt amongst African Americans to try to send that message, but that message wasn't heard, and because it got drowned out in the sound bites of the moment. And to one group it was seen as not being heard, and to another group it was seen in a different way. And now people are saying, since I wasn't heard, I'm going to now do something that's more loud and more aggressive. And I think if we don't find a way on both sides, from an all-inclusive standpoint, to find a better way to communicate to each other, like you talked about in your sermon, to open those doors, then we wind up creating a situation where it's only one side who's got to fix the problem. And that usually winds up with no one fixing the problem. That's just how I would build on that.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Bill.
Hey, George, it's Buzz. Let me build on that just a little bit. And Bill, your comments, I think, are right on. One of the things that struck me about both Chief Shields and the mayor in their discussion about the protesters' right to be heard, which I completely get and understand and support. And to Bill's point, I think we have an obligation, and we being the broader community, we have an obligation to listen. And that, I think, is the missing piece, that the protesters across all the spectrum of things protested, people have a tendency to just drown it out and ignore it and don't listen. And if we listened and considered and exercised our critical thinking skills, I think a lot of change could happen. But people appear to me to be really unwilling to listen. And I think that's an obligation of a good democracy and as good Christians.
George. Thank you, Buzz.
George.
Harris.
Good morning. I would like to take up that theme that Buzz and Bill have introduced and offer one additional piece to it. I think the best that each of us can do right now is to listen, and listen in ways that perhaps we haven't listened before, expose ourselves to the other in the way that George was talking about last week, in an active listening mode. And there is a very specific opportunity that we all in this room have, this chat room have, to do this, and perhaps in a way that we haven't done before. Tomorrow night, our bishop is going to be joining Catherine Meeks in the third in a series of webinars on the lament of COVID. And Catherine has assembled people primarily of color on her speakers list and her panel list, and across the 3 different webinars. And I personally have found these webinars to be very insightful and in introducing me to new and different aspects of this, getting me up in front, right next to the other. It's like the other is right up next to the glass. My nose is right next to the glass on this. In the chat room that we have here, I'm going to be putting in an email that Catherine has sent out, and she's inviting people widely to attend this tomorrow night. It starts at 7:30, and I hope people will be joining me for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Other thoughts or comments?
George, I'd like to append. Maybe Dan can help me with this. I'd like to append a file that would have the invitation on this. Is there a way that I can do that?
I can, Harris, if you'll give me a few minutes, I'll find the link to that event and I'll put it in the chat.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan.
Okay. Well, thank you all. As I said earlier, the image that has really come to me in the last several days is that of a broken heart. And I think we have a choice. We can allow our hearts to be broken and lie on the floor in shattered pieces because our image of the world has been either destroyed or simply revealed as being incomplete and fragile. Or we can allow our hearts to be broken open, in which we become more receptive to things we didn't see before, problems we hadn't identified before, or the inadequacies of the solutions that we thought would work. And I think that image of a heart being broken open is how I'd like to feel. I'm vacillating at the moment, but that's what I'd like to feel. And I think that does involve the listening and the common good and the exposure to the other that you have all identified. I would say that those things you can find both in yourself, like listening to yourself, which may, for example, include listening to your own history and hearing things out of it that you didn't hear before, recognizing how race played a part in your life that maybe you didn't even see before, and with your newfound skills of empathy and compassion, putting yourself in the position of whoever it was who was victimized by that, and recalling that entire story anew so that it speaks to you in a different way. That would be an example of listening, which is a powerful spiritual practice, like revisioning our own histories. And then, of course, there is listening to the other people who already have those different experiences. In all cases, I think, triggering compassion, triggering empathy. And it is with that new information, those new feelings, that we cultivate a higher level of consciousness, which is what we've been talking about since September. How do you grow in your level of Christ consciousness so that you learn to see more of the world the way God sees the world? And that's not just about do's and don'ts or rights and wrongs. It's also about having the imagination to see the reality of it all. I want to pivot a minute to Arthur Brooks. Brooks says this: we don't have an anger problem in American politics. We have a contempt problem. If you listen to how other people talk to each other, either in political life today, you'll notice that it is with pure contempt. Now, I'm using this larger frame because even though it looks like what has happened in Atlanta over the last couple of days is a racial issue, and it is, at least for me, impossible to separate it from the larger issue of identity and where we draw our identity in America today. Are we drawing it from our ethnic groups? Are we drawing it from our regional location? Are we drawing it from our affiliations with political parties? Are we drawing it from our socioeconomic status? Or are we drawing it from our universal status as children of God? And of course, we've been trying to explore for a year what it means to identify as a child of God. What does it mean to say the kingdom of heaven is within you? What does it mean to say that the glory of God is a human being fully alive? All of those are identity questions. And I think that's where we are. And so I want to take our experience of the last couple of days and look at it for a minute through the lens of identity. And that's where I think Brooks is saying we don't have an anger problem. Anger, in many cases, is actually just fine. Righteous indignation over the victimization of another or the injury of someone who can't protect themselves, whether it's on the school ground or on the streets, is a fine example of anger. But anger tends to lead to a solution. There's something that you want. Contempt is simply the dismissal of another person. Contempt, whether it's with eye rolling or sneering disregard or sarcasm, is a way of attacking the very humanity of another person. And you don't have to go further than our last political debates, the presidential debates in 2016. Wherever you stand on the political spectrum, I bet you can identify moments of contempt in any of those debates by both candidates. Eye rolling, sneering disregard, sarcasm, all of those are ways in which we dismiss another person. And that culture of contempt, I think, is creating a major obstacle to the love that we would like to bring into the world. Eye rolling, sarcasm, sneering derision. What do you do about that? The Dalai Lama has responded to this very question on several occasions, and each time he says, practice warm-heartedness, which is to say that the solutions to contempt lie inside of us. So our first focus is not on the external problems, but on our internal disposition. You don't stop there, but you start there. That too is a theme we've used throughout the year. We start with our inner life, and then we carry what we learn over into our exterior life. And in doing that, we increase our ability to be compassionate. It's not just trying to be compassionate with the old me, it's how am I compassionate with the new me who is operating from a higher level of altitude, who is able to see more, feel more, be more present. That's the role that religion plays, I think, in raising our level of consciousness. It's not just an intellectual exercise. And you'll live longer. This is John Gottman, that many of you might recognize as a researcher into relationships. He started as a marriage therapist, and he has identified the 4 horsemen, he calls them, things that will absolutely destroy any relationship. The way he has conducted his research is that he invites couples onto a retreat, which is surrounded. I mean, there are cameras everywhere. There are cameras in your bedroom, there are cameras in your common areas, there are cameras in the walkways along the woods, and he just tells you to go about your life at first, and they're videoing all these ways that couples react to each other and then analyzing them. And he can, in very short order, tell you what your problems are in your relationship just by watching you. It's really quite fascinating. People are consenting to this, of course. But one of the things that he said is insurmountable. A relationship cannot survive it, is contempt. Because once there is contempt, there's dehumanization. And where there's dehumanization, there's no connection. And without connection, there's no relationship. So you can see that, I believe anyway, we have entered into a culture of contempt that is antithetical to the relationships that we all crave. And as long as we're participating in that culture, we really can't be loving and compassionate the way we would like to be, the way Jesus taught us to be. So Brooks has come up with 5 rules. These are rules that he says will help us step away from the culture of contempt. And the premise here is that the culture of contempt depends upon our participation in it. It's not an independent thing that can be on its own, just like a fire. No allusions to the Pentecost fire, of course, but just like a fire needs oxygen to survive, a culture of contempt needs us to buy into it before it can live. So rule number 1, stand up to the man. Refuse to be used by the powerful. I want to give you two aspects of this rule that I find interesting. The first is that I want you to take a moment and think about a politician that you think uses contempt to manipulate people. Let an image of that person come to mind. A politician who uses contempt to manipulate people for his or her own purposes, of course. Now, without revealing how many people, well, let me say it differently, without revealing, I want you to ask yourself, was the person you identified somebody in the other party, somebody that is not somebody you admire or follow or listen to? For most of us, it will have been. So now I want you to do the exercise again, but this time find the politician in your party that you think often speaks the truth, or at least can, and that you listen to. Try to see somebody in your party who uses contempt to energize you, to manipulate you, to get you to hate the other side. For me, that's an unpleasant part of this exercise, but a necessary one. I don't like to be used. And I'll bet you don't like to be used either. But we are all being used all the time if we allow ourselves to be manipulated by people who want to manipulate us, who want to stir up our negative emotions so that we'll demonize, dehumanize, and distance ourselves from the other side. So now that you've identified the people on your team who do that, over the next week, don't listen to them. Don't watch that show. Don't read that column. Don't listen to that podcast. Simply cut them out of your life for a week and see if it changes the way you feel. It's a good way to, I think, get a sense of how much the culture of contempt has worked its way into us. Now, some of us have had this experience because of the shelter-in-place orders anyway, that there was something about the changing of that pattern of life which unplugged us a bit from some of the social media or news sources that we were so plugged into before. But don't just focus on somebody on the other side. Having contempt for contempt is still contempt. Focus on somebody on your side and disentangle yourself from them. Rule number 2, escape the bubble. Go where you're not invited and say things people don't expect. Now, you can do this, of course, by going to another part of town, going to another country, walking into a gathering of somebody of the other political party. But we are cathedral members, and all we have to do is come to church, because we are fortunate enough to have people across the political spectrum who are there right in church, right on our Zoom call, right in our classes all the time. So all we have to do is pay attention to escape the bubble. Yes, we need to unplug from those social media sources or news sources that tend to control us so that we can listen or press our noses up against the glass. But they're there. We just have to listen to them. And in listening to them, invite them to speak. But also say things that people don't expect. And don't just say them to the other. Say them to you and your people and your side and people that agree with you. Once you distance yourself a little bit from contempt, you'll start to recognize it. And at first you may have contempt for it, but over time, instead, you'll simply recognize how potentially toxic it is, first to you. I mentioned before that Gottman says you'll live longer, but they've actually verified that in empirical experiments. That people that hate more get sick more often. That people that show contempt with greater frequency actually don't live as long. It's actually injurious to your physical and emotional health. It's not just a spiritual nicety that we should follow. So in saying things that people don't expect, say them to yourself or others, not disparagingly, right? This is not about showing that your self-righteousness has unearthed their contempt. It's about not letting people get away with assuming that you believe what they just said. You can't do this all the time, of course, but pick your spots and try it. A step at first, and then when confidence is gained, a bit longer step. Now, I warn you, you may get invited to less parties, and people may not be sending you as many emails with articles they have read, but you'll be okay. And you'll learn something about yourself and something about contempt. Rule number 3, say no to contempt. Treat others with love and respect, even when it's difficult. I just want you to remember our mayor and our chief of police, who I think have, in circumstances I can't really imagine, done exactly this. They have been loving, they have been strong, they have recognized the dignity in others, and they've told the truth. And you know it had to be difficult. But I didn't see contempt. Even on Saturday night when things got hard, I didn't see contempt and I didn't hear contempt. Passion, but not contempt. Rule number 4, disagree better. Be part of a healthy competition of ideas. I know that I often believe, let me just get through this without disagreeing with anybody. I'll listen and I will have my best therapeutic face on when I do. But I'm not really agreeing with you, of course, and I'm not really saying anything back to you because I don't know how to do that without having it flare up into a bitter or resentful conflict that I don't want to have. So I think it behooves us to figure out how to disagree better. How can we disagree without it seeming so personal? How can we say, I think there's a larger picture here without it sounding like you're an idiot for not seeing that? Or how can we say, I think there's another way to look at this looting without having an implication, and by the way, you're a racist. Sometimes we hear this in the context of competition. Competition is bad. Cooperation is good. I think that's wrong. I think competition is good. I think we see it in free markets. I think we see it in free expression. And I think we see how when we are competing, we do better. We come up with better solutions and we come up with growth. We have turned the percentage of the world who are hungry, we have reduced that percentage remarkably through capitalism, through competition. There's plenty of cooperation inside of that, but all competition is not bad. Unhealthy competition is bad, right? Healthy competition is not bad. The purpose is not just to win the game. The purpose is not just to defeat the other side. The purpose is to do the best you can. And often you do that, I think, when you're competitive, when you're driven, when the expectations are high. Disagree better and be part of a healthy competition of ideas. My final comment on that is you can see this happening, that is the unhealthy aspects that this rule addresses, when people refuse to give a platform, whether it's at a university or at a group, to a speaker who doesn't agree with whatever their ethos is. There are people outside the bounds of appropriateness, okay. But inside, watching people disagree with each other is wonderful and educational. Learn how to defend your position. Don't simply exclude the person who's making the opposite argument. How many times do we see people who have the kind of friendship that Antonio Scalia, before he died, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg have? Or, I forgot the guy's name, but whoever, the very conservative guys at Harvard that Cornel West is so close to. There is a way that we can disagree without losing our relationship. Now, in my sermon, I express this using the image of why you're there is more important than what you're doing. Why you're doing something, looking for the truth, is more important than where you have landed at the moment, what you believe the truth might be on your path. Disagree better. Finally, tune out. Disconnect from more unproductive debates. This is really a version of the advice given in the context of rule number 1, but seriously, think about those things that wind you up and cut them off. It's amazingly healthy to do. Okay, 5 rules. These slides will be posted, but I'm wondering if those rules resonate with you, or if you don't agree with them, or if they prompt any other reflections. Okay.
So George.
Yes.
Hey, it's John Dean. So there are certain people, certain other people on this call, they know who they are, to whom I would like to say that in the future, I hereby promise to disagree better.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I appreciate you not naming me. Yeah. Unfortunately, I cannot see you. So Dan, are there any other questions or comments, raised hands, or people that appear to be sitting on the edge of their seat about to talk?
Not that I see, George.
All right. Let me summarize all of these rules, I think, into something very simple. Go find someone with whom you disagree. Listen thoughtfully and treat him or her with respect and love. The rest of it just flows from there. And that, I think, is the Pentecost moment. This is the day of Pentecost, the day when the sound of the wind rushing into the room gave rise to tongues of fire that sat upon the head of each disciple. They found voices they didn't know they had, and people heard them who didn't expect to hear them speak. And what happened was a community. Bonded groups were bridged, found something in common, determined that why they were there was more important than what they were doing, and found a way to have a common good. This is our faith, I think. This is why we come to church, to be reminded and taught and practice doing exactly that. It's rooted in the love that God has for us. And as we collectively, because we need each other to do this, learn to live out that love, we will become different people in the world. I've offered you 5 rules that could easily become 5 practices. And I encourage you to spend some of this week trying them out as a way of becoming more available to God's love inside of you and more able to let that love flow out of you. Because that's what Jesus did. Take what he received and made it flow again. I'd like to close then with this prayer. So we are not going to unmute you, but I invite you to unmute yourselves and simply say this prayer. We can all hear the cacophony that our various voices make, but as I've said before, that's not a bad image of community. And in light of the 5 rules I've just articulated, maybe not a bad image of how we reach agreement over disagreement. Let us pray. This then is what I pray for you, that the Spirit of God give you the power of your Spirit, grow strong, get rooted and grounded in love. You will be able to understand breadth and the length, height and depth, Christ's everlasting love for you. Thank you for joining us this morning. May you have a love-filled day of Pentecost. And look forward to seeing you next week, if not before. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.